the idea sometimes in self-help circles, I think, if I shape myself in the right way, if I train myself, if I have the right mindset and the right goals and the right habits, those are going to be amazing tools to be a better person. Now, they are tools and they will make you a better person. But if you really want to exert power on yourself and the world, think about the situation. Either change the situation you're in or choosing a different situation altogether. Those are the most powerful tools you can use in terms of helping yourself and accessing well-being.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick Rodell. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Don Berg. Don is the host of the Agentic Schools Podcast and the award-winning author of Schooling for Holistic Equity, How to Manage the Hidden Curriculum in K-12. As the executive director of Deeper Learning Advocates, he is on a mission to embed the psychology of learning in policy so policy stops undermining learning. He runs Attitutor Media and lives at the Joyful Llama Ranch in West Linn, Oregon. Hi, Don.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you.
Indeed.
I know I say that all the time with my guests, but I do really mean it. I find that you all are very interesting, and I'm very much interested in your work, actually. But I know that this conversation is going to focus on what living well means to you, your personal philosophy behind that. I'm sure that your ideas about education is going to seep through that. But I think that that this is going to be a very interesting conversation because education is is one of the primary reasons why I'm doing the podcast. It's an educational podcast to explore ideas about well-being. And so before we go into all of that, I know I just read that introduction, but I like for our guests to introduce themselves and share how they feel about themselves in the moment.
Yeah, so Don Berg, wow, that's me. So one thing that usually gets kind of glossed over is the llama ranch. I do live at a llama ranch. So my partner's been breeding pack llamas for about almost 30 years now. I've only lived here about 10 years, but it's really interesting the difference because I've lived in the city. Like I grew up in LA area, and have lived most of my life, in cities, in the middle of the city, and moving out to a llama ranch was really a change. And it's really interesting how different it is to, have a forest outside my window and have, these big animals that just hang out with us. It's really great. And so I think that's something that there's something to learn from that. Is part of understanding wellness is partly about, and the good life is partly about realizing, like, what is it that really does feed your soul, feed your who you are, not just in physical terms or even psychological terms, but kind of in that larger sense of like what is it that really brings out the best in you, the best in everyone around you. And for me, it's being a llama ranch is pretty cool.
That's awesome. That's so awesome. Glad you shared that. You're right, though. I completely glanced over that part. I'm like, wow, all this academic stuff is very interesting. The educational stuff. I'm like, okay, yeah, cool, Llama Ranch. But I'm glad that you brought that up and how important that is to you and living well. And so,
Right.
by the way, what does living well mean to you? And we'll unpack it as we go along.
Right. So, living well is a constant challenge in the sense that there's so many things in our society today that draw us away from what actually keeps us well, what actually enables our well-being to be fully realized. And so, just one of the things that we're participating in a form of media right now that is very attractive in a lot of ways. and attractive in ways that may or may not be contributing to our well-being. Um, I'm actually pretty invested in it. Like you said, I also host a podcast and am participating in it in a certain way. But I also realize that there's a limit to that. Like for instance, people talk about turning, at the beginning of the movie, this, turn your cell phone off. It's like, or turn your ringer off. It's like I never have it on. Like I if you try to call me, I probably won't pick up because it's going to go to voicemail because I don't do that. And that's just a strategy I have for um, taking care of myself, of not being constantly interruptible, um, not always having that something to intrude and do. Now, part of that developed because when I was writing I've written a number of books, and when I'm kind of involved in the writing, then I get into this space of just complete focus. And writing a book really requires that focus to be uninterrupted for a while. What I did was the Schooling for Holistic Equity, the one you mentioned, um, is actually I took some other self-published works and then kind of wrapped them into one with some professional editing and really getting it done right, which is why I was able to win an award. Um, but that really getting that done meant kind of taking out a lot of distractions. Now that was in a sense a COVID project, in the sense that I wrapped up when COVID hit. I was hitting about 8 years in an environmental nonprofit where we're fighting air pollution, industrial air pollution in Portland, Oregon. And I was doing things that I was treasurer and basically the main administrator for this organization, and it was a very stressful job. Eventually, at first it was it kind of started more part time, but eventually it was full time. In the last year, not only was I doing the environmental nonprofit, I was also because I developed these campaign finance reporting skills, because as the particular kind of organization we're running was we were doing political work that needed to be reporting to the state in certain ways. So I developed the skill of doing all this reporting, and so I took on a bunch of candidates, but that was the opposite of the well-being stuff. It was stressful, it was intense, and especially when I piled on some candidates. Boy, I mean, it eventually led to a kidney stone. I
Mm.
think that was a big thing, and so part of my philosophy now, especially around well-being, is to really recognize when you're going down that path um, uh, towards the opposite, towards the antithesis. You're going the wrong way. Um, Adding on work that now the industrial air pollution is worth fighting. So I was purposeful in the work I was doing. However, the actual tasks that were required, constantly working with spreadsheets and numbers, and like those are things that, yes, I had the skill, but that wasn't where my passion was. That wasn't what really drove me as a human being to be alive in the world. Um, and so when after COVID hit, and we were, most of our actual activity was canvassing, so sending people out, knocking on doors or on the street, raising money, which I did myself. By that time, I was more in management position, but having done that, it was shut down, of course, by by COVID. Not to mention everything else, but like so when everything kind of transitioned, shifted. I was, what, this isn't really the thing that is feeding my soul. I had, because I'd done those other, taken on those other clients, I had kind of built up enough money to say, okay, I need to put that behind me for now. So I was done with that, transition. It took 4 people to replace me. uh, so, so I was doing a lot for the organization. And I think it actually was a benefit to move to having 4 people do that work, because those 4 people are probably doing a better job at every one of those things than I was probably doing as someone who was mostly self-taught in those things and figuring it out. So better for everyone for me to move on at that time. Now, I'm sure it was important and valuable for me to do that work for a lot of reasons, but um, so for me, um, that was kind of doing what you can do, and that enabled me to make that transition. This is the point. uh, Enabled me to make that transition to um, to commit to what is this purpose that I'm pursuing. The bigger purpose is education. I want to transform K-12 education. I want children to have a better experience in schools than I did, and I was successful in school. Um, I went to an elite college. I've done a lot of that. School in some ways served me, but even when I was a kid, I recognized that this wasn't as good as it should have been. I just couldn't articulate why. Now I can articulate why. So the transition after COVID. So I end of 2020, I quit the political work, all of it, just gone done, and then started figuring out, okay, what do I do? Well, one of the things that came out was the book. So I came out. What was it? And I remember 2022, the end of 2022. So it took me a while, but I'd already written some books. But anyway, this is the place where, like, okay, I'd saved up some money. I was able to, put some investment in it and take the time, with my partner's help as well, to really live at a llama ranch, not have my phone ring. This is one of the things of being, with the organization, is like, yeah, I had to be available to take calls from people. Now I don't have to do that. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone can afford it. But for me, that is really working. Not having constant interruption, or even the threat of an interruption. Although, yeah. So for me, it's really figuring out what is it how can I shape my world to support me in all the ways that produce the well-being I know. So part of it is, I look out there and say, okay, how do I need to align with the world to have my well-being supported? What support systems do I need? And then part of it is also, just tuning into myself and being like, okay, what is it that I really need to be doing, you know, to support that, to make it a two-way street. I need to be, but I also need to be, putting something in the world that's of value, and that does that for others as well. So.
That's awesome. I'm glad you gave those background information there, because I think it's important to say, to offer some context for how you see living well or well-being, and the factors that have influenced you in that process, and that understanding of what living well means to you, and how creating those favorable conditions is an important piece of the puzzle for you, and how you're in a situation where those conditions were such that even though you were trying to do a good thing, you're not trying, you were doing a good thing.
Right.
Even when we're doing a good thing, we can also cause problems in our lives, and it can be physical, psychological, emotional. Can't say causation necessarily about the kidney stones, but there's some correlation there. There's some likelihood that there's some mental stress that has manifested itself in the body that contributed to those kidney stones. So I think that I think saying all of that and giving us a context for why living well is important to you, I think that's what I gather from that. And why it's important to create favorable conditions. You mentioned something about passion, finding something that you're passionate about, even though you're passionate about an aspect of the work that you were doing, but all of the other details of that work was kind of pulling you away from a passion that you had, which turns out to be transforming K through 12 education. And sharing with us, the rest of the world, some of your ideas about what that looks like. And well-being is intertwined within that process of transforming K through 12 education. And you also mentioned something I think that's important that we can sometimes forget. Just because you did well through K through 12 doesn't mean that, well, I did great, so therefore it must be fine. But you're able to step outside of yourself and the benefits that you gain from it, and acknowledging that there are benefits to it, but also recognizing that it can be better.
That's right.
I
That's right.
admire people like that because you're not so to me, it appears that you're not selfish.
Hmm.
You're interested in the well-being of others because you're saying, well, it was great for me. Well, not 100% great,
Wasn't
but I
great.
did, but I did well through it. So I mean, it should be fine. I went to elite schools. I have a PhD, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's okay. You're like, no, it's not okay. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do to enhance that system to make it
Mm-hmm.
better for the lives of so many folks who don't tend to do well within that
That's
system.
right. That's right.
Uh,
Well, I think
so
part of it also is that part of the reason we think it's doing fine is because there's sort of a mismatch between what we think is supposed to be going on there and what's actually going on there. When the system cannot recognize, even though it's getting, jumping through the hoops, and it can't recognize the ways in which it's actually undermining its own mission. It takes grades as indicative of education. It assumes grades mean something. And in fact, that's completely untrue. No teacher that I've ever talked to and has thought about it for more than 5 minutes believes that grades mean anything.
mm-hmm.
It's just that it's a systematic way of sort of, there's ways that it's useful to the system, but it's not useful to any human beings in the system. And so there's a mismatch there, and that's part of where a lot of what I've learned in psychology, because that's where my degree is, really comes down to that. Is like, oh, actually, we do know the sources, the literal causal sources of mental well-being, and that's needs that we have for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Not like vaguely, but like no, those specifically, they cause it. And so when you have a system, education, schooling, more properly schooling, when schooling is undermining those needs, and specifically the need for autonomy, is when the expectation is that teachers should tell you what to do and that you should merely obey them, neither of which supports the autonomy of either of those people. It may seem like it on the teacher side, but it doesn't, because they're usually being told what to tell them to do. uh, the autonomy support is not there. And now, in the past, there was a point at which we didn't know that was a thing. And so it makes complete sense that back then, we thought we were achieving a higher good by telling children what to do. But now we know better. And so it doesn't make sense anymore. Now, the challenge is also that how do we communicate that? And that's why I write books and do websites and podcasts. Now that we know better, we know there's a cause, and we know what that cause is. Now the challenge is, how do you then change the system to align with that truth about how human beings are in the world? Because of a system that contradicts it, and it needs to be different than it is.
Yeah.
Um,
Again, oh, I'm sorry.
yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things where I got lucky in being interested in a topic that serves all the, like it actually goes to the source of well-being. Like, I didn't go into studying things. I wasn't looking for the source of well-being. But it turns out there it is. And the topic I happen to be interested in. I was very lucky in that. And so it became it becomes an interesting challenge. Like, okay, one, it did shape some of my understandings about how to proceed. Because if autonomy is a need, and you have a system that is top down that is thwarting that need, then you also have to figure out a process of change that doesn't thwart other people's autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I can't just I can't expect to go into the system and say, I know better than you, and now you have to do what I say. Because that directly contradicts the very principle that I'm saying is the cause of well-being. And one of the interesting things about it is that, particularly around well-being for yourself, is that you can't tell yourself what to do. We literally have, this is one of the most fascinating things about psychology,
Mm-hmm.
is that we can actually have these aspects of ourselves that one can try to tell the other what to do, and that literally doesn't work, and it actually diminishes your well-being rather than heightening it. Um, and I had a roommate many years ago, soon after I left college the first time without a degree. I actually went to college in two different spurts. In the 80s, after 3 years, I dropped out. And then in 2012, I finished up. I had 2 years at the where I actually got the degree. But anyway, back in like I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, I had a roommate. We were both studying a martial art and an Indonesian kung fu style. And I thought he was, really a disciplined guy. He was really, he was really dedicated to the martial art and really, focused. And well, a few months later, after he moved out, after kind of parted ways, um, he kind of went nuts. And that's a crude term for it, but he literally had a break with reality and had to, you know, uh, be institutionalized, as I understand it. And then when I look back on it, and now with the perspective that I now have and understanding this role of autonomy, is I think what he was doing was that he was telling himself he needed to do like he was bossing himself around, and it looked like from the outside great self-discipline. Well, if it's great self-discipline, but it's not aligned with your own, like if you're doing it for this extrinsic reason, this out, like if you're just guilting yourself into doing stuff, that's actually not supporting your well-being. So you need to figure out one of the really difficult things about self-improvement or self-discipline is figuring out how to get it done, whatever it is needs to be. Like, I'm a little heavier than, like a lot of people, I'm a little heavier than I probably ought to be. That would be optimal for my health. But I also know that I can't guilt myself into an exercise program, or like, I have to figure out strategies that actually feel like they're consistent with enjoying it and getting it done at the same time. And like I have to think through and be clever to figure out, okay, what's the strategy that I use to get this, to do more exercise. Or I was doing Orange Theory for a while, and recently had some injuries that put that on hold. But how do I do that so that what are the things that I need? Once again, I look outside and I say, okay, what are the supports that I need in order to make this most productive, most enjoyable? And one of the things, the reason that I go to Orange Theory was because there's a whole bunch of other people who are doing it. It's like, oh, okay, I think one of the things I really enjoy is doing it in a group, whatever it is. Exercise in particular is in fact, now that I think about it, I was a swimmer and a water polo player in high school, and then yeah, just in high. Well, I was a swimmer from a kid, like a competitive swimmer, for from when I was a kid, all the way through high school. And then let those go and did other things. Uh, and eventually even the martial art. It was like, it was, I really enjoyed not only the physicality, but the community in which we did it. And then when I was done with that one, it's like, it's when I find a social group that I'm most engaged. And so for me, it's like, okay, where's the group that I'm going to join to be able to do this? um, so it's really interesting to when you understand that you have a need for autonomy, and that need has to be supported both internally and externally, then you start to think differently about how you're going to achieve any particular goal that you have. Um, yeah, yeah. So
That's great. That's great stuff. I'm going to try to say a little bit about that, because I think you brought in a whole lot of pieces of the puzzle here that I think is really important. Again, coming back to those creating those favorable conditions,
right,
and
right.
I'm glad at the end you said creating those favorable conditions externally as well as internally,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea of needs,
Mm-hmm.
having our primary needs met, is an important part of the educational experience that gets negated a lot of times in our current way of doing schooling. I like how you
Yeah,
say
yeah.
schooling, and how important it is for us to tap into this idea of autonomy. But you also said, the way I interpret what you said, that autonomy is not merely a conceptualization of ourself,
Mm-hmm.
this idea of ourselves. Because you gave an example of someone who on the outside looked like they were doing all these different things. Oh, they're very disciplined and everything. This is great. Yet they were trying to satisfy an idea of themselves that was in conflict
That's right.
with a nature, an aspect of themselves that extends beyond the conceptualization that they've created for themselves. Now, that conceptualization that we have about ourselves comes from our experiences,
Mm-hmm.
comes from the environment, comes from our educational experiences. And this is how
Yeah.
you should define yourself as a person. And we try to um, live up to that idea of ourselves and think that that is a level of authenticity. But there's a
Right.
conflict there. That's actually not authentic. That's actually not being autonomous. That's actually being imprisoned by a conceptualization of self
Mm-hmm.
that we've been, um, I want to inculturate it, I would say,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's not completely indoctrination because we've actively participated in this process.
That's right.
But it's based and shaped based on our shaped by our experiences, our educational experiences, and I guess that every experience is educational to an extent.
Right. Right.
And I think that this idea can create those favorable conditions. Where how do we create the conditions where we can actually tap into a real sense of autonomy, some aspect of who we are that extends beyond the conceptualization about who we are as a person,
Mm-hmm.
and allow that to be expressed out. And I think again, how you come back to creating those favorable conditions for experiences that facilitate this um, understanding of our autonomous self, or
That's
this
right.
realization of our autonomous self. And you mentioned earlier about passion and how finding something that is truly moves you,
Mm-hmm.
compels you. Again, this is my words. Compels you is a part of that process of realizing our autonomous self.
Right. Right.
This aspect of ourselves that's not just merely reduced to a set of conceptualizations that we've adapted based on our experiences. I want to say a little bit, because I want to continue down this path if we may.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to. You said something about some of the causes of well-being,
Right.
and the things that you're doing at your work in education. But can you say what are the attributes of? Now you did mention joy, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that that's a part of it. Um, what are and community,
Mm-hmm.
doing
Mm-hmm.
activities in community? You mentioned that. What are some other attributes of living well or well-being,
Mm.
and how those causes influence those quote unquote outcomes or those attributes of well-being or living well?
Hmm. So, so one of the interesting things about the psychology is that you understand. I can list off autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And those are on the same scale as air, food, shelter, water, sleep. Um, they, I can, those are all technical terms in some way or another, but they're not the way we normally think about it day to day. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so when I talk about joy, joy is a consequence of having all those needs met.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, and this is an interesting aspect of it. So joy and passion and there's different aspects of passion. This is actually passion is a in the literature in psychology. Is there's a distinction to be made between a harmonious passion and an
Mm-hmm.
obsessive passion
Yeah.
because the consequences are different. A
Mm-hmm.
harmonious passion is not only something you're passionate about; it's passionate and it produces more well-being. An
Mm-hmm.
obsessive passion means that you are really into it, but the consequences of that can be potentially negative.
Mm-hmm.
So making that distinction between and this is especially well studied in sports because that's actually one that's very amenable to people having the passion, like they develop the passion for it. You think about kids who have a particular, who become, elite at very early ages. Um, if they become elite at an early stage, they're being rewarded almost literally, oftentimes, for their skill. and for their competence at this. Now, the thing is that just because you have the skill doesn't mean that you necessarily have all the components of curiosity and interest that then get you to go the deeper with it. So think about a good example is Tiger Woods, who he wins his first major championship, or maybe the Master, anyway, something really big, and then he's like, "Yeah, I need a new game." You know, it's like he then went back to the basics. He basically tore down. I mean, it tore down in this sense, tore down his swing, and he was actually very passionate about, but it is from all indications it was a harmonious passion, the kind of passion where he was like, yeah, okay, that was interesting. I won big, but now what's really interesting is I could do even better. Um, Whereas obsessive passion tends to be something where they get to the top and then they're going to hold on tightly. It's like stick with the winning formula. Whereas a harmonious person, harmonious passion is going to lend more opportunity for them to, they're not focused on that external reality validation of themselves or their skill level or anything like that. It's like, yeah, they're people perceive Tiger Woods as like for some people that seemed like a big risk. It's like, okay, you got to the top, and then stick with it, or take your whole game apart, which which literally means, I mean, you're gonna get worse before you get better, especially if you change everything up. But uh, but that's the indication that something's actually good in the world, good in how he's approaching it. I mean, you can look at other people who uh, McEnroe, John McEnroe, the tennis player, was the opposite. His was an obsessive passion. He admits himself that he was. I don't know if you'd use the word toxic, but people could clearly perceive the way he behaved on the court, that he was, really volatile emotionally and in other ways. He had the skill, but he was not regarded as a very nice person. uh, he and eventually, I think I've seen interviews with him later, after he retired, I think, where he realizes, that wasn't the best, and he's, recognizes that it was a limiting factor. And in the same sport, now I don't remember who it was exactly, but there's another player who's also at his level of skill, and I think around the same era, may have been coming up behind McEnroe, but anyway, someone who was very methodical and systematic, and was in his early days. And McEnroe, I think, was recognized very early and was, like really good at tennis all his life. This other kid was not, he's seen mediocre for most of for a long time, but he was so systematic about it that he eventually reached McEnroe's level. In fact, since I can't remember the name, I can't remember who exactly it was, but really got to that world class level through the hard work. Now I don't know whether his was excessive or not, but it, for the fact that he stuck with it, a very clear system for a long time, suggests it was probably harmonious.
Mm-hmm.
So the properties, the things you're looking for, the components you're looking for, in a technical sense, are autonomy, competence, relation, the primary needs. But in more common speak, the way we commonly talk about it is, yes, you're talking about joy and passion and fulfillment, and you can use a lot of other terms, um, and what you're meaning is that when we talk about joy, how do you produce joy? Well, you don't need to pursue it directly, but you do need to make sure that your autonomy, competence, and relatedness needs are being met, and then that's where you find it. So in a way, you could say that the benefit of knowing about what the primary needs are is, I don't know what makes me autonomous until I go into the world and figure that out. So you can approach it with that curiosity, the curiosity of like, oh, what is it that does fill my world with passion, or um, I that's where the schooling piece did not serve me well. Was I had the skill to do the work, at least to a passing degree. I mean, I didn't have spectacular grades, even though I did get into elite schools. I didn't have a great grade point average. Um, but I could do the work and, wrote good essays. But that wasn't tuning me into what really gave me juice life, it wasn't, academic things were stuff I could do, but it wasn't inherently the thing that gave me joy. I would have been far better off as a human being had I figured out what are the things that bring me joy earlier in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so in one sense, my work is all about, I don't want any other children to be suffering under this school system in which they are not being exposed to things where they can figure out what is it that brings them joy. They need to figure that out. And they need the freedom to figure that out so that they can then, you know, there's probably a lot of things for most people that could bring them joy. But if they're not figuring that out, they can't begin to discern what are the themes, what are the ways that, for me, it's being in groups that really, brings it out. But I don't want to be part of groups in which I get bored. Because there's certain things that like, you can begin to see what are the things that really uh, do that for you. And for me, it's things that are, there's uh, things that like when I watch, I'm a big fan of movies, right? Um, but there's certain kinds of movies that I favor, and it's complex plots, complex characters. So what frustrates me is movies like what I don't find interesting is movies that don't combine those things. Like there's many other features of movies like special effects and animation and like action and things like that that are interesting to some degree. But if it's not backed up by complex plot and complex characters, I'll get bored. So for me, that's like, okay, I recognize that, and so when I start looking at the different kinds of films that are available, you can be like, oh, okay, what are the likelihood? Okay, the Fast and the Furious series, not so much. Um, However, the stuff around the Mad Max that's been coming out, the last two, Fury Road and the Furiosa, those are fantastic. They're built all around action and kind of silly action in a lot of ways. But what they did differently than the earlier ones was characters and plots, and actually like having a coherent world in a sense. They built on the old stuff, with the world they built, and it's spectacularly funny and weird in some ways. Um, but there's real characters there. There's real, like, they were actually figuring out what is the plot line here. What is how do these groups interact with each other? They're not just thinking about how that single character at the center of the movie does things, because that's usually the way that they construct what limited character is available. Is like, well, focus on that one character and then figure out how they're going to do things, um, and then do a lot of action around that. That's not much, not much to go on. But that's where they've changed. They've done something different. But it's finding things like that. I, you know, I don't think in terms of uh, the needs, but being curious about and open to, okay, where am I going to find the next thing that really jazzes, is interesting. So since that's another to read. The reason that the movies more than TV is because there are two things that really make TV limiting, and that is commercials
Mm-hmm.
and and a lack of complexity. Is that if you have a short time span, it's very rare that you get much going in that. But now what has happened, and there's actually a really interesting thing in this. Over time, what has happened is that TV shows have become more complex. TV shows, there are some TV that I do watch, but usually it's because I can binge watch them without having the commercials in place. Because that's the thing that just I have very little patience for, is the interruptions. If there's a commercial interruption, it's like that ruins the experience for me, and so I pretty much don't watch anything that regularly has commercials, because it's that I like to focus and get involved and be immersed. But if they keep breaking that open, it's like that just destroys the quality of the experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been great. So I grew up on TV. That's another thing. It's like I grew up on it, I know exactly the effect it has on me. And, it's like, I'm really glad I grew up in a time when, mom kicking me out to go outside was a common thing. Because if I'd have grown up on screens, I think I might have had a very different experience. Um, but, but that was something that I was able to really get clear about what I liked about it and what I didn't. And now that I have the option, I can only take that experience in this way that I know is like I can get immersed. And I just binge watched True Detective season 4. um, like, oh, okay, that was pretty intense, and it was like I think I binge watched it basically in 2 segments, and unfortunately, this time span between the first part and the second part was like I was for most of that second viewing experience, I was like, wait, who's that? Like catching up with what who the characters are and all that. But that's like I didn't have all the interruptions, so I could just binge watch. And in fact, I was second half most of it was on the airplane. I was coming back from the Aero conference in Minneapolis, and so I was like binge watching True Detective on the airplane. So uh, that was fun. Yeah, so I think I got off topic there.
Oh no, no. I think that there's something in that. I don't necessarily think get off topic. I think that there is something about the meandering of the mind in terms of what you're trying to get at, and I think those things like you say, you don't necessarily have to focus on those needs. I think it's nice to articulate them, have it,
Right.
to share what those are, but also it's what I was calling those attributes, those qualities of well-being, that finding something that you're interested in, something that you're connected to, something that gives you a little bit of joy,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I think that joy is not it's pleasurable,
Right.
but again, pleasurable. We're looking at that from a nuanced perspective, just like you broke down a passion there.
Right.
There's
Right.
different types of passion. Not all passion is necessarily contributes to well-being,
Mm-hmm.
and why it's important for us to consider again those conditions
Right.
that we create to facilitate an interest or a sense of joy. I would, you can, if you don't like this term, you can say so. I use the term flow.
Mm-hmm.
You find something that you're in flow with, that there's a certain level of harmony with the things that you're doing in your life. That's associated with living well.
Mm-hmm.
Does that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is the guy who
oh
studied
yeah.
flow, and so yeah, he's in terms of yeah, that's it's interesting because there's even some schools that say they're going to aim for flow, and it's like I think flow is a little bit like happiness. It's probably best not to pursue it directly. It is
Mm-hmm.
something you do want to experience it because um, flow is essentially the uh, that magic experience that's between like being bored and being overwhelmed is like it's on that scale of like towards the challenging side, but not quite to the overstimulated, overwhelmed side. Is you're so absorbed in what you're doing that the level of skill that you bring is exactly matched or so closely matched to the challenge that it presents that that you're in that zone. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's one of those things where it's good to understand what that is, and that it is not necessarily the most common experience. Um, but I think what you should be doing is rather than pursuing it directly, it should be something like, okay, that's a sign that's going really well. That's like
Mm-hmm.
this is a sign of a quality experience that you're having. Um, so there's if you think about happiness as a broad way of characterizing more than just like the flow state isn't a happy state if you think of it just purely an emotion state. But so you think about happiness in several different kind of ways. One of
Mm-hmm.
them is it just in hedonistic terms is like uh, there's the things that are simply pleasurable or exciting or interesting just in that moment of like, okay, that's cool. But you also have these things of where skill is at stake. Because you can have pleasurable thing, you can eat something that's really tastes good, okay? But that doesn't, like, as the consumer of it, making it different story. But if that becomes a thing that you're interested in, then you can think about the skill around it. So not just the flavor, but the skill of producing it. You know, so those are two aspects of happiness: is not just the pleasure in the moment, but also what did it take? What did I invest in this to create this experience? And then the
Mm-hmm.
third component is really that purpose, that bigger picture. How do I plug into the world more great in a greater way? So for me, the reason that I got into and developed the skills that I had in that political realm was because I really enjoyed solving the puzzles, developing the skills around these different systems of finance, and like how we were actually keeping track of things, making sure people got paid, the payroll, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into running an organization like we were doing. And so there were puzzles to solve, and I enjoyed that. Um, so that was what kept me, what got me into it was I self-taught, I taught myself how to do QuickBooks bookkeeping years before, for the same reason. Just like when somebody asked and said, "Can you do that?" And I said, "I'll learn." And they said, "Okay." And I actually got work doing that. Um, but it was problem solving. It was constant puzzle that I solved. I actually took a local paper from with about 300% revenue growth in about a year, because I improved their cash flow and done a whole, like okay, I had some measurable success in doing that. Um, and then that led to the political work, which, you know, once again, there wasn't really a bigger purpose at that time. It was just a skill I developed. But then when I got to the air pollution, and okay, that's it, but then I was kind of tired of those skills, and after 8 years, I'd never finished solving problems because there's always problems to solve.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Right.
but I was had so many different sets of responsibilities that it took 4 people to replace me. So as I was at a point where I needed to integrate those different aspects of the happiness picture, those three elements: the hedonistic, the craft, and then the purpose. That's where writing books and things like that, more recently, and even podcasting and things like that, is like, okay, now I'm taking this thing that I've just been jazzed about for decades, K-12 education, and now I'm really focusing on it. And I've worked, really working on those challenges and trying to articulate and trying to figure out how, so now it's more, it's I won't say it's completely balanced yet, uh, but it's on the right track, and I'm not artificially creating a lot of stress for myself. That's what the political work was doing for me, was just generating stress without necessarily being on what I felt was my longer path, my real path. So now I'm able to be on that path, and finding places where I can be in that flow experience, which me Csikszentmihalyi noted that conversation is actually one of the most common ways to access
Mm-hmm.
flow. It's just having a conversation with somebody. Reading can be a really great flow experience. Um,
Mm-hmm.
So there are some really accessible ways that people can do it. Um, and then, for me, and then learning about that stuff actually helped me develop my sense of how to understand well-being and wellness. Is that, oh, okay, there's always nuance. Yeah, but having frameworks to understand, okay, there's these different aspects. So when I see myself kind of diving into one thing, to say a hedonic, like my partner and I had a day of, when we were a little, before our flights uh, from Minneapolis back home. Um, we had some time, so we went out to a park, which had a bird sanctuary, and it was really a nice. I forget what it was called, but we had a great time because we were just like able to be in that moment of like in nature. We I was posting about, we caught a frog and we saw some, various bird. We saw cardinals. I think we saw both a male and a female cardinal, and what else did we see? Uh, anyway, but just being in that experience, it wasn't being in that park was killing time. Like we just had time, we between things. It didn't Visiting the park in itself didn't have some great purpose. There was no great skill in being in that park. Okay, but it was a great experience because we were able to, and both my partner and I work well together. We're kind of no drama kind of people. so 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 we're able to flex with each other's impulses and moments, like, oh, let's go this way and do this thing. And it's like, okay, and off we go. Or if there is conflict, we can pretty well negotiate and figure out how are we going to make this work. And that's, I think, a really important, like relationships is a really interesting place, because it's like I have had other partners wherein that wasn't really the same. I have had partners where it was more of a challenge, of like there was a stronger, you know, resistance to the other in some way, or I'm not sure if that characterizes it well, but we certainly had a different way of relating to each other. And I think about, I've kind of gotten better at choosing partners, I think. Because I think I've had less of that over time.
Yeah.
Less and less of that conflict. So
Yeah, again, you're saying a lot of things here as you're saying all this, and you brought in relationships, those components, those aspects of flow, and the experiences of joy doesn't have to necessarily have like being in a park,
right,
quote unquote, killing time. But those are those
right,
moments, and creating those conditions in our lives that we can have those types of experiences, and being in a relationship with an individual that you feel a resonance with.
mm-hmm,
That there are challenges, of course, but you're able to resolve those challenges. You're able to. There's a certain mutual appreciation
mm,
of each other's choices or habits of mind in some capacity, not
mm-hmm,
everything, of course not.
sure,
So I think all of those things are an important part of living a good life,
right,
and having those, and again having something that you're intrigued about, something that challenges you, something that motivates you, something that gives a sense of joy, and happiness. Again, not just hedonistic happiness, not just
right,
moments of pleasure. All of those things are important facets of the good life. And again, I know I keep coming back to that because you said in the beginning, this idea of creating those favorable conditions. I think that you're hinting at that as you tell your stories here, because these stories are relating, at least to me, that a lot of it is about putting yourself in circumstances. And I see that it seems that you're a little hesitant to say exactly that the good life or living well are these set of attributes. I think what I'm hearing from the way that you're articulating this is it's not just a set of attributes.
mm-hmm,
It is it's the conditions, because you're state the
right,
conditions, and then you're talk about how those conditions influence your life or
mm-hmm,
impact your capacity for well-being. And I like that because I think that well-being, wellness, a living well is a process. And yes, I like to talk about various attributes and qualities of that, because I think those qualities and attributes are they're terms, and these terms are only pointing a finger to an experience.
right, right,
And what you're doing, you're speaking about here are the conditions, and let me make some qualifications for these conditions, and then here's this experience that I get from those conditions that I'm setting up.
right,
Be it
right,
looking at a movie, looking at film. It's okay. Here are the conditions that are important for me to have a moment of joy in this film. There needs to be some type of complexity. There needs to be some kind of nuance in the character development. I think that there's a lot to glean from these stories. Because you're I think you're directly doing it, but also indirectly pointing a finger to the importance, the value of setting conditions for experiences that are highly likely to maximize well-being. And does that, am I just off a little bit, or am I saying something that makes sense?
It sounds about right. I think one of the things that's interesting when I think about particularly, like, if someone's listening to this to try to find the secret of happiness, okay, it's probably not going to happen, right? But I think one of the most valuable things that you can do towards that end is to come at it with curiosity. Is to bring, like, so one of the things that is really clear from a lot of research is that I'm naturally predisposed to a certain degree of happiness, of just I tend to be very positive and optimistic and things like that. Not everyone has that set level that I do. I think a lot of people have a lower level. So one of the things that you can expect is that if your overall tone in your life has been like you don't experience high highs, don't expect that to become something that you will, if your tone has been low for a long time, or for all of your life, okay, don't expect to become someone who's optimistic overnight, or like you can increase, you can kind of, there's a range. Say this is the full range of human possibilities. Well, if I'm set pretty high, my range is probably pretty high, but my range is probably, like, there's a difference between sort of my most likely is in here. Doesn't mean I can experience those things too, just that they're going to be temporary. But what I can count on is going to be, there. Well, if somebody else is down here, they're going to have a different experience of life than I am. But it doesn't mean they can't move a little. You can start to move a little bit. You might be able to shift it. So the question, the thing to figure out is, how can you maintain curiosity about how that experience, what experiences are happening? Like, being curious to find out, to figure out. One, how should I define my range? Is my setting low? My disposition sets my happiness at some low level? Then I can be a little happier. That's a more realistic expectation than can I become happy, as if I'm going to achieve the highest possible level. On a temporary basis, there are ways that you can spike to that, but don't expect that to change your normal. You can move your normal a bit, and you can probably, if you're careful, if you really want to be careful about it, you can train yourself to be a little higher. That takes some curiosity, and then some ways to, how can I reinforce the things that bump it up a little bit? And I think if you really want to make a sustained shift, you need to think in those long-term ways of, like, how can I train myself to have a slightly better experience than I did before,
Exactly.
on average. And that's actually something that I think is highly accessible to anyone, is I can move my average up a little. What does it take to not have the low lows? What's just making the top less of a limit and more of just whenever it occurs, I'm not going to take myself down. That's something that there are some people who, when they get high, they feel out of control. And so they automatically limit themselves and take it down a notch. I mean, we do that to children all the time.
Yeah.
You're having a high right now and I can't handle it, so calm down.
Right? Shut down.
Yeah. I mean, we do it. And in some cases that's necessary. But in other cases, like, is it really necessary for me as an adult? Like I do this, is I look at their exuberance and I say, is it unsafe? If it's unsafe, then yeah, I may need to bring them down a notch. But if it's not unsafe and it's just bothering me for whatever reason, or I think it might be bothering someone else, then I have to ask myself, one, who these are children, and those other people who might be bothered, if they're adults, then they need to act like adults and get over it. Like I don't need to manage them. There's some, I homeschooled other people's kids for about 5 years, which meant that I took kids out on public buses like every day uh, for a long time. Um, and so I would have to kind of manage kids in the bus in a public, public transportation situation and say, are they getting a little too wild? Like, are we going to get kicked off the bus? Uh, I did have some times when that was like seemed like it could have been a possibility because the kids were being really rowdy. But then I would, figure out a way to negotiate with them. I did actually have a step off a bus at least once, maybe twice, and then kind of renegotiate what's going on, and then get back on and finish our trip. But really being curious about how much do I need to manage, and this can be I was managing children, literally someone outside of me, but you can say the same thing about yourself: is how much do I need to manage myself? Am I really in danger if I allow this joy or this sadness or whatever, if I allow this intense emotion to happen? Am I really coming to harm if I do? It's going to be hard to have that conversation with yourself in that moment, um, but by being mindful about it, you can begin to say, reflect on, this thing happened. I had a really intense emotion. Did I shut myself down, or was it just ran its course? And you can start to be curious about and reflect on what happened. And it's really hard to actually decide what actually happened because our memories are very shaped by the emotions we remember. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's where outside help can be a really helpful thing. A supportive partner who's willing to reflect on your behavior. If you come to them and say, "This seemed like this to me. Is that what you experienced?" And compare notes. Therapists can be a really good sounding board for that, and there's a little more safety there in some ways because of their professional obligations to that. Plus, their presumed level of skill in handling that um, is really, really helpful. In fact, I've been to therapy a couple of times, um, but it was usually around uh, some level of intensity where I wanted that kind of feedback of like, this is how I experience this. It seemed really intense. Am I sane, or is this, you know, uh, fortunately, I mostly was. Uh, um, but that's one of those things where I think it is really important to figure out what are your uh, how can you check in with what's going on and validate or invalidate, if as the case may be, validate what you think is going on, maybe even reshape what you thought how you think about it, but then just be curious about, okay, you know, can I uh, be more forgiving of an extreme emotion, or be more uh, accepting of emotional intensity, without necessarily being smushing the feelings down. That's one of the classic things. And I think that my as an American male, there's certain kind of the toxic masculinity is a term, and I think it's actually a valuable one, because I think there was a certain form of masculinity that if it's you having to suppress your autonomy because it's not masculine, or suppress your relatedness because it's not masculine or enough, um, that's one of those things where expectations that counter your primary needs are a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we need to be able to reflect on the cultures in which we live and say, is this working for me? One of the ways that to take it to an extreme, one of the ways that cults, what we would call cults, or these oppressive cults, one of the ways that they operate is that they get you to choose. So they get you to choose to suppress your own self as a
Mm-hmm.
mechanism of being part of the group.
Yeah.
So it's this really bizarre mix of taking autonomy and relatedness needs and mixing them up so that your autonomy suppresses your relatedness or your relatedness suppresses your autonomy. Neither of those things is okay. Is you have both needs and they both need to be supported. So how can if you're in that situation where, well, like my friend who suppressed his own autonomy, or that's my theory. If suppressing your, and part of the reason that works really well for me is when I did swimming and I did athletics, some of that was uh, because my two older brothers were into those things, and so I just followed them around and kind of did those things with them. Now, eventually, I did other things, and eventually, I when I was in high school, I chose those sports to pursue. After having tried out some other sports and realized I didn't like them, they were even worse. Or not worse. They weren't any better. But I knew I wanted something, and so I chose water polo and swimming, which also followed my brothers. Um, but that was before I had the words to articulate it, was a way of me of kind of gut checking, like saying, hey, is this really the thing I want to do? Or was this because that's just what they did?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I, found, yeah, that for that time was what worked for me. And so it fit just fine. Um, and then since then, it's sort of, that's, I think, a valuable skill is reflect on, where am I being supported? Where is support maybe not fully there? And can I either change that situation or choose a different situation? Those are what I call our psychological powers. Um, Change the situation you're in, or choose a different situation to be in. There's two other psychological powers, um, which are about basically mindfulness, or you're being mindful of your own mental processes. I'm forgetting how I phrased those, but they're when you talk about personality, um, that's actually pretty weak in terms of what causes your own behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So working on yourself is actually it's good to do. It's important, um, but that's not going to make the biggest difference into how you are in the world, and particularly around your well-being. It's those two around the situation that are the most important. Um, is picking the situation and ensuring that the situation is structured in a way that supports you, rather than like the idea sometimes in self-help circles. I think if I shape myself in the right way, if I train myself, if I have the right mindset and the right goals and the right habits, those are going to be amazing tools to be a better person. Well, they are tools and they will make you a better person. But if you really want to exert power on yourself and the world, think about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Either change the situation you're in or choosing a different situation altogether. Those are the most powerful tools you can use in terms of helping yourself and accessing well-being. Is how did the situation shape me, and did I choose a situation that was actually really doing the job of supporting me to be the best me I can be. And that's where I think I've my access to well-being is largely about that. Is living with a partner who is really supportive. That's amazing. But that's a big
Mm-hmm.
situational factor that is really important.
Yeah. Wow, this has been great. I love how you oh, I just love all the things that you bring in. I'm like, oh my God, we can explore all of these different subjects that you touched on. And we'll run out of time here,
Yeah.
but you've touched on so many things that I'm not gonna go there because there's this part of me is like, oh, we can delve into that one. We
Yeah.
can talk about all these different pieces. But as a listener, me, myself, and as an audience, I hope you uh were able to glean into some of those ideas that Don just articulated, because there's a lot there. There's a lot of different pieces to the equation of creating those favorable conditions to live to well-being that Don just mentioned, and there are quite a bit of them that you can tease out from the story that you've just illuminated us with. Can you? I usually like to do this at the end here. I know we're over time. We're never over time, but I do like to ask this final question. Are there any final words or thoughts that you would like to share with the audience before we sign off here? Anything you would like to share? Any final thoughts?
Well, I think actually that I'll leave it with that the idea of the situation as the most important tool, because I think that in a lot of ways is the message that I think is the most important, particularly people who are on a path, thinking about their well-being and thinking about the good life, is that sometimes, particularly in people on that path, want it to be that I can just change myself and the world will be a better place for me. It is important to be mindful. Mindfulness is a really great, piece. Really working on your own inner process of being in the world. That is important, but I think the real power comes from the real most substantial tool you can use is to think about the situations themselves. That how does that world shape who you are? The central finding in psychology is we're not who we thought we were. Whatever intuitions we have about ourselves, they're almost entirely wrong. Because what has been discovered is that the way that we interact with our world is super important, because the world is doing a lot more to shape who you are than you give it credit for. And so being mindful about how you pick the situations you're in and shape those situations. It's both, but situations are far more powerful than we normally give it credit for. So that's, I think, the central message today.
Awesome. I love it. And I've used that term, conditions. What are those conditions that we create for ourselves or to put ourselves in?
That's right.
Or
That's right.
that we find ourselves in. Thank you so much, Don. This has been awesome. And there's a lot there that we could have explored, and maybe we'll get an opportunity to do this again.
I hope so.
I would love to have you come back here and dig deeper into your take on education and how you're interested in reforming education. Let's dig into some of the details of that. That would be an amazing thing to unpack. So this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.